Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I will save you the trouble of reading my biography, or a short bio. I'm a social anthropologist. I've worked with mobile peoples forced to settle and settled people forced to move for the last 40 years. And so I want to really bring us back to Lebanon now and address an issue related to the Bedouin of the Badiat al-Sham, or basically the greater Syrian desert, of which part of Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, is a finger of. I want to start by saying a little bit about an interview that I made in January, not in Lebanon, but actually on the edge of the empty quarter in an area, sort of a triangle between Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the United Emirates. I was talking to a camel herder, asking him about what he saw the future would be. And he said to me, listen, al-badu badu, al-hadar al-hadar. And then I could add al-nawar al-nawar. What he was saying to me, those of you who are familiar with the famous historiography, the kind of dichotomy between the Bedu and Hadar, would recognize, was that he wasn't saying Bedu, i.e. backward, Hadar, i.e. civilized or civilization, which is a common way of interpreting this dichotomy, but he was saying the Bedu are Bedu, i.e. they always move. Al-Hadar are Hadar because they are settled. And I've thrown in Nawar because Nawar is a concept, a community, certainly in Lebanon, that's often confused with the Bedouin. I throw that in here because what he was talking about is notions of attachment to space. So you could almost say that the Hadar are settled, they are the social community who understand or deal with the notion of private property. The Bedu are basically, at one time, pastoral. They needed to move. Their attachment to land wasn't direct, it was through their animals, and they relied on concept of miri or musha land, i.e. common land. And the Nawar move, but they don't have an attachment to land. So they move where there are economic possibilities. They often move, and some people look upon their movement as seasonal. It is seasonal, but it doesn't have that same kind of notion of movement with a particular kin group. So how do I relate this to Lebanon? What I want to do is, and I'll show a little map, which very few of you need, but I want to look really at Lebanon's eastern borders in particular. I could have looked at some of the Bedouin settlements that existed at one time in the Maslach district and also in the Karantina in the 1970s, but most of these were totally destroyed. And also they were very multi-ethnic. The areas I want to look at are really Bedouin settlements. The whole of the eastern border of Lebanon, of course, is an area of refuge, originally for Armenians in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and Palestinians in the 40s and 50s, but also some Bedouin refugees from the Jolan after 1967. So it's a mixture of refugees, but also Bedouin. The tribal community, the Bedouin, are both invisible in some ways, but then they're also prominent in many others. What I'll try and do in the 15, 16 minutes left is show you, develop a kind of sense of the multi-layered identities of the Bedouin as they correspond to various community settlements, to various membership categories of citizenship in Lebanon. And I'll try and show how mobility and to some extent still, some cross-border attachment is still important, and hopefully also show that the informality of the settlements are not necessarily illegal, that we're talking about a marginalized and discriminated minority that are very Lebanese. So here again, what I'm talking about really is the anti-Lebanon mountains and the western Bekaa Valley, which I said earlier, is actually an extension of the Badiat al-Sham. So for centuries, there's been a great deal of movement between the Bekaa into the area that goes towards Palmyra, between Homs, Hama, and Salamiyeh. However, in the more current eras, most of the movement is north-south up to the area around Wadi Khalid, but up and down the Bekaa Valley. Now, how did these settlements come about? There isn't much time to go into a history, but as I said earlier, we know that Bedouin have been moving throughout the Bekaa Valley going back to at least the 13th century. Some of the tribes are very well known. The Fa'ur, the Al-Fadl, the Hassana are the big tribes associated with the Bekaa Valley. And at that time, most of the Bekaa was Musha land, certainly along the anti-Lebanon land. It was owned in common by the tribes along lines of lineage. I can't go into a great deal of detail of that, but at the time of the French Mandate and also the period of the Arab Revolt in the 1920s, three of the big tribes based in Lebanon fought protracted battles against the French, and having lost many of these tribal communities, rejected the French effort to register all members of communities in Lebanon, in the Bekaa. So many of the Bedouin refused to register in the 1932 census. Now, I bring this up because, again, one of the interesting transformations that has taken place, when I first began working with the Bedouin in Lebanon 40 years ago, I was commonly told there are no Bedouin in Lebanon. If there are any Bedouin here, they're from Syria. There was a rejection of the idea that they were Bedouin. Now, this has changed. I've begun following the newspapers. You can see that change has come about. But the reason for that was that so few of the Bedouin had actually registered, and so very few of them actually had legal documents or had citizenship. Throughout the period of the French Mandate in particular, the French began to promote private land ownership, and most of this Miri and Musha land was sold off by the French to local landowners. And although there has never been a policy of settlement or sedentarization of Bedouin in Lebanon, the growing restrictions on movement as more and more of this pasture land was being bought and turned into agricultural land basically resulted in great restrictions on movement. In effect, you could say that the land that the Bedouin commonly occupied was declared terra nullius by French authorities, and then that position was also adopted by the independent state. Now, this is one of the first pictures that I ever took in Lebanon in 1972. Unfortunately, you can't see anything like this anymore, but this was very common. And if you look behind the tent, you will see basically what's a two-room cement structure, which was also used by this family in the winter. But during the times when they migrated with their animals, the tent was set up. The structures behind were very simple, as I said, basically two rooms. These structures never faced each other. Very important that you always had an unobstructed view. So some of the informality that you'll see in the current settlements basically reflect this importance of movement, this importance of unobstructed view. Certainly not to see into your neighbor's front rooms. Over the decades, more and more of the Bedouin families began to build these kind of cement blocks for themselves. Those that had greater wealth, those that didn't, basically use tanak or thin metal sheeting. But another element of this organization was also the importance that was built up by the leadership of these tribes with the large landowners in Lebanon. And this was reflected certainly in the springtime by the setting up of huge white tents that were used to welcome the tribal leaders to come and settle any kind of disputes that took place. And these tents were generally on the agricultural land, the fallow land of the farmers in the Bekaa Valley. The last of these tents really hasn't been set up in about a decade, unfortunately. What you're seeing more and more is a kind of gradual settlement of the Bedouin, not so much because of government policy, but as I said earlier, because of restrictions on movement and rapid privatization of ownership. But at the same time that this is taking place, the Bedouin continue to be basically unrecognized. They're not regarded as an ethnic group, certainly within Lebanon. About 50,000 of the Bedouin in Lebanon hold citizenship. This is the group that registered in 1932. But somewhere in the region of 100,000 do not hold citizenship. In 1956, there was an effort to regularize the position of the remaining Bedouin in the country, and a special category was set up, which is that their papers were under study, this category of Qaid al-Dars. In 1994, a move was underway to try and regularize the position of some of these Qaid al-Dars individuals, which was accepted but then pushed back in 2000 because of objections by one of the political parties. But basically what you have is a group with citizenship, a group whose papers are under study, but a growing group who are now maktum al-Qaid. These are generally the children and the offsprings. No citizenship, no possibility to gain access to government services, water, electricity, education, health, but certainly members of Lebanese society. The point I want to make, and there's not really a lot of time to develop it in great detail, but that the Bedouin really are developing what I'm going to call sort of translocal multiple attachments. One of the Bedouin who we interviewed pointed out that for a long time Bedouin villages were located across Lebanon and Syria, but then there were no borders. But then once the French came and defined borders, things got very confusing. Another Bedouin who we talked to in the Baka, and I should say the Bedouin in Lebanon do not like to be called Bedouin. They only like to be called Arab or Asha'iri, whereas the Bedouin in Syria prefer the term Bedu or Arab, the same with Jordan. So there are really very important distinctions. So I might use the word tribe or Asha'iri instead of Bedouin. Another individual I talked to said, look, we are the Haruk. We have proof from a long time ago how long we've been living here. We've had houses for a long time. My parents owned 40 acres of land before any other Bedouin had anything here. The Haruk have always been in the Baka, but the Mawali come from Syria and they go back and forth in the winter. And the Aydin also, they come here only in the summer and they go back to Syria. So there's kind of a distinction that's beginning to emerge amongst the Bedouin, those who are always here and those who aren't. And this actually, hopefully I'll have time to come to that, relates to the efforts to get the unrecognized settlements formalized and recognized. I suppose I could have searched for a map on Google Map, but I didn't. I tried to search for some sort of a map that showed that these settlements actually exist, but we couldn't find any evidence in government records. And the kind of sketch map that you see here was produced through a participatory process with a number of residents. But that's the best we could do at this point. But maybe I'll have to talk to a geographer and see if we can see what would show up on a government map. This particular settlement is Faour. It's not far from Kfarzabad, which is a recognized village. Again, just to quote from another informant, said, if we go back in time, there were no states, so we could support our people in Syria and Lebanon and vice versa, but today we can't. There are states, there are systems, there are institutions, and there are borders. But if we belong to Asha'ir, on which land do we belong? Is it in Syria? Is it in Lebanon? There must be a belonging to the state with the conservation of the Asha'ir through the organization of the name of the Asha'ir or the tribe. This effort to somehow put down roots where there were never roots. If you think of tribal organization as having horizontal linkages rather than vertical linkages, there's the recognition now that in order to move forward in Lebanon, they have to find a way of sinking some kind of roots. A number of things have happened. I can't go into a great deal of detail, but as the traditional sort of elite tribal relationship between landowners and the important members of the community has begun to decrease, there's been a kind of emplacement in these informal, unrecognized settlements, along with a desire to be recognized as modern and civilized, which is, I think, one of the reasons for this recent rejection of the term Bedouin. But there's also been a growing interaction with the municipalities where these informal settlements occur. And in spite of this growing relationship with municipalities where their informal settlements take place, if I give you the example of the settlement of Faour, which I know has been in the papers recently because so many Syrian refugees are actually flocking to this area of unrecognized settlement. Before the Syrian refugee crisis, we had estimates that Faour had a population of about 35,000 Bedouin, still not recognized by the Ministry of Interior Affairs and Municipalities as an entity of its own. The residents of Faour still had no right to form a municipal council, although certainly in terms of size it was large enough, nor did they have the right to elect civil officers like the Mukhtar or Makhatir, but instead they are scattered over the edges of 4 government municipalities. So their effort to sort of find a place within the Lebanese economic political structure is still thwarted. But this difficulty has created a different kind of tribal solidarity. And what seems to be emerging is that their sense of tribal identity is being reinforced as they project themselves with a modern identity. And ironically, with their reduced physical mobility and longer presence in the Baqa, they're beginning to use this emplacement as a political presence, as a leverage in local and national politics. I just say, because the time is so limited, that particularly post-2005, the Ashayer has begun to be recognized, members of the Ashayer, as important in the national political landscape. Although they are looking at themselves as Bedouin or Ashairi, they are being recognized as Sunni Muslims. And so they have been approached by the March 14th, sometimes even March 8th political groups in order to cast votes for particular elections. So this multiple identity that I'm talking about, if I go back to the member of the Harouk are part of the Faour tribe. They're also residents sometimes formerly of Kafarzabad, sometimes of Faour, which isn't a recognized settlement. They're also considered Baqa, Sunni Muslims, sometimes supporters of March 14th, or sometimes, if disgruntled from Harrirism, supporters of March 8th. So they're beginning to play with multiple identities. That is the third of this large group that actually have citizenship. And even before you said time's out, I'll just wrap up. So what I'm trying to put on the map is the importance of the Bedouin, the significance of both mobility and emplacement in these unrecognized villages, the way in which they're beginning to develop a voice in politics, which is quite different from the political manipulations of 30, 40 years ago, where their tribal leaderships tried to work with some of the Jumblati party, for example, and so on, in order to have their Qaid al-Dars transformed into true citizenship. It may be that now, as Sunni Muslims in the Baqa, they may move into that direction, and their unrecognized settlements may at some points become less minimal, less liminal, and they'll continue to manipulate the meanings of mobility and emplacement, periphery and center to their best advantage. Thank you.